All right, welcome everyone. I'm gonna get us started, and then as more people join, we'll just let them in. But welcome to one of our ACPA 100 webinars. This one will focus on the 100th anniversary issue of the Journal of College Student Development. And I'm really excited that today we're joined by the authors of the various pieces from that special issue. And so before we get started, I'd like to start with our land acknowledgement. And so related to our mission of supporting and fostering learning through the generation and sharing of knowledge, ACPA College Student Educators International would like to acknowledge that the land each of us is on today is the original homelands of Indigenous and tribal nations. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from these territories, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land. So please take a moment to honor and acknowledge the Native and Indigenous peoples from the land you are on. Give some thought to your ancestry and the generations that came before you, and ponder how you can continue to decolonize your work on your campus. And so in that spirit, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Gudrun Junt. I use she, her pronouns. I am a faculty member at Northern Illinois University and a member of the ACPA 100 Steering Committee. And I'm joining you today from the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe peoples, also known as the Council of the Three Fires, which is also Naperville, Illinois. And so if you would like to take the chat and introduce yourself and share where you are joining us from today, please feel free to do so. I'm going to do some tech magic here and switch my screens. Basti Torres, our current editor of JCSD, was unfortunately unable to join us today, but she recorded a short video, and so I'm going to share that with you all. I'm going to make sure we have the best sharing options so that you all can hear the sound. And she will do a little introduction to talk to us about this special issue. Okay. And someone give me a thumbs up to make sure the sound is working.
I'm Basti Torres, the 11th editor of the Journal of College Student Development, or JCSD as we commonly refer to it. I'm also the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education at Indiana University, Bloomington. Therefore, I'm coming to you from the indigenous homelands of the Miami, Shawnee, Potawatomi, and Delaware people. Though JCSD seldom publishes a special edition, the 100th anniversary of ACPA was considered a special event in the history of student affairs. The journal is widely known for consistently advancing scholarship centered around the tensions between remembering the past, revising what is known, and preparing for the future. In this special edition, we attempted to look at ways that scholars are investigating both traditional and emerging topics. For this reason, it is our hope that this issue of JCSD will become a springboard for conversations about the future of student affairs and higher education. Most of the articles published came from an open call for manuscripts. We were delighted to receive 70 proposals, from which we selected 5. An additional 2 were invited to address specific issues within the field. As the editor, I would like to highlight each of these articles in this volume and how it advances the ideas for the field and challenges us to think differently. As a scholarly journal, it was natural that we would consider revisiting the relevance of the foundational theories upon which student affairs practice is based. The authors of the first article are an intergenerational team of scholars, Duran, Avis, Stewart, and Jones. These scholars have both built on as well as critiqued existing theories. This article advances the need to reestablish critical views of student development as a foundation for higher education and student affairs. In the next article, Brown and Smith use social network theory to place learning as a social process that may create structures that provide opportunity or exclusion. The authors highlight how power plays out in the learning process within our campuses. The article addressing campus climate offers strategies for resistance that can create critical hope for equity-centered work within higher education. Briscoe, Johnson, and LePeau focus on how practitioners can move forward as higher education is threatened by outside forces that may not have the same values as our field. The remaining 3 articles focus on aspects of the field that every practitioner considers within their work lives: use of social media, leaving the field, and university leadership. Martinez, Aleman, McCready, and Rowan investigate the impact of social media has had on generations of college students. Given the emergence of new tools, there is little doubt that technologies will continue to influence college students' lives and our own work. Newent, Preedy, and Thomas interviewed former student affairs practitioners and developed a departure model that illustrates the conflicts practitioners face daily. This article seeks to disrupt practices that create conditions that may not retain diverse faculty within the field. The article on university leadership by Espino seeks to challenge leadership discourse and proposes an emergent view of these positions as existing in racialized spaces within organizations and structures that can result in inequity. The model presented in this article illustrates how 4 intersecting structural processes create these racialized spaces for leaders. The special edition also included a translational educational research piece, or TER, as we often refer to it. This piece was written by the host of Student Affairs Now, a podcast that uses conversations with scholars and practitioners to translate research into public scholarship. As a podcast, Student Affairs Now has made research accessible for administrators to stay informed about the latest research and trends. On behalf of the editorial team of JCSD, it is our hope that this special edition of the journal reflects the groundbreaking and innovative effect that ACPA has had on the field of higher education and student affairs.
All right, and so with that, I get to turn it over to Antonio Duran, who's representing the first author team, and we'll talk about their article.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction. Hello, folks. Wonderful spending some time with you all today here in this space. I have the pleasure of representing our author group for our article titled Looking Back, Moving Forward, and Everything in Between, Revisiting Student Development's Relevance and Enduring Concepts, written with Elisa Abus, D.L. Stewart, and Susan Jones. As Vasti previewed in her video, this was one of the articles that was actually commissioned for the special edition. And specifically, the intention of the article was to explore how is it and is it that student development still remains relevant as a foundation of the field, especially in the present moment that we're in. And so, to start off the article on the manuscript, we found it necessary to contextualize where we're seeing the field situated within. And in particular, we uplift the sociocultural and political landscape in which we find ourselves in at this present moment. As all of us are aware of to some degree, we have a number of critical issues facing the profession. The first is the ongoing COVID-19 global pandemic, and specifically for our work, how the pandemic has shifted perspectives on work and ableism, and what it means to be an agent of the institution. We're also seeing an increase in legislative attacks on minoritized people and knowledges, as we're seeing state and local movements that are targeting critical race theory, intersectionality, and DI more broadly. And then lastly, we continue to see this rise of the technological world. When the height of COVID came along, we were able to pivot to asynchronous and synchronous technology because of the available virtual and digital means that we have. And this will continue to kind of complicate how we socialize students into the field if we consider that many of them will no longer actually interact with a physical campus. So with that context of the of where we're operating within, we open up the manuscript talking about how student development has long been a foundation of the field, ever since the 1960s and the 1970s, where we kind of firmly named that this development of the whole student and the accompanying theories and research that would allow us to do this work was going to be a pivotal groundwork for our field. And yet, if we're presenting this question of whether or not student development has remained relevant in today's day and age, we found ourselves also having to confront this question of, well, what remains relevant? As people who study and teach student development theory, we often come up against this rub of, do we still teach the theories that gave rise to our work in that emerged from the 1950s or the 1960s or the 1970s? Are those still relevant given the context in which they emerged? And if some of it isn't, what is left behind as we move forward into this third wave of student development that prioritizes critical and post-structural views on students' overall development? And so the bulk of the article comes up in this revisiting the study of student development. And in particular, we found ourselves constantly referring back to these questions that were first posed in an article from 1978. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Parker, Lee Knufflekamp, and Wittick edited a volume in 1978 that outlined central questions that student development theory was confronting at that time, highlighting different developmental theories and area of research that higher education and student affairs professionals could be using. And in their opening remarks, they outlined what they defined as kind of the areas of study that student development theory at that present moment was engaging with. And they have these four areas that we still find having relevance. And yet, in our reworkings and revisiting of student development theory, we thought it was time to update these areas of study. And so Parker, Knufflekamp, and Wittick, talk about how student development research allows us to understand who the college student is in developmental terms, how development occurs, if the college environment is positively or negatively affecting development, and then lastly, that we're presented with this concern around toward what end development in college should be directed. In revisiting these areas of study, we held on to some of the core of these concerns while also adding more nuance to them, given our shifting scholarship within the realm of student development theory, as well as these critical and post-structural reimaginings, right? So instead of just understanding who the college student is in developmental terms, we found it important to name how student development research should be attentive to who college students are and how we situate their journeys before, during, and after college. If Parker et al. Talk about how development occurs, this third wave of student development theory is challenging us to consider how development occurs within larger systems of power and oppression, and so on. For the purposes of the presentation and the short time we have available, we want to talk a little bit about this fourth area of study that we uplift in this reimagined list. So if we are thinking about toward what end development in college should be directed, we find a number of issues that we thought needed to be addressed. In particular, this idea of toward what end development in college should be directed assumes that development can be acted upon, that there is an end that is desirable, that educators themselves are more developed than students, and consequently are those who are helping direct them along toward that end. But also, we have seen situations in which individuals use the language of a developmental end or a developmental destination to marginalize students who are not quite there yet. And so in this article, we actually contend that as a field, we need to disinvest from this developmental trajectory that assumes a particular end and instead open up what development itself signifies. And we argue that this is actually not a new idea. If you read some of this or earlier student development research, and specifically that of Heath, right, this challenging of a developmental end has been around in student development theory and related fields of psychology, social psychology, etc. But we have come to a point that we really do need to wrestle with this concept and instead open up what development should look like. Toward the second part of the article, we talk about the need to further understand what is happening in between the waves of development. So Susan and DL in 2016 talk about the waves of student development and acknowledge that they're not chronological and that they overlap. But we have found that in our own writing, we haven't actually talked about, what is it that remains in the waves? If they overlap, what actually has continued? And in doing so, we uplift certain concepts that we see as having endured the first and the second wave. So this role of context, the negotiation between self and world, these are ideas that have remained from the first and second wave, and that are still ever so relevant today, as we're seeing more and more critical reimaginings of student development. And finally, we talk about what it means to mobilize student development in the contemporary moment. And we wanted this to be extremely relevant to people teaching about student development, but also, of course, for HESA professionals who are mobilizing student development in their work. So when it comes to teaching, we had numerous conversations about how we even teach this supposed foundation of the field, right? And that, we frequently find ourselves still teaching the first and second waves, because we held on to this idea of like, well, there's still important concepts that emerge from the first and second wave, so we should still teach it. And here we give permission, honestly, to ourselves and to others to say that it may not always be necessary anymore to go have students read about Perry or have people read about Kohlberg, but instead to frame the discussion more around, or what are some of the still the concepts of differentiation and integration, for instance, that Keegan wrote about, that still are informing our work with students. So even though we can still take something from the waves, it may not be necessary to actually be teaching the first and second wave content in a way that still puts them as the foreground. And then second, we're confronted with this question of like what it means to teach in a shifting and contentious sociopolitical context, right? So if people are no longer allowed to assign anything that has to do with critical race theory, well, what does that mean when our third wave of student development employs critical race theory as as a theoretical framework in some instances? So here we talk about some subversive practices that we encourage educators to engage in moving forward. And similarly, we talk about how in practice, this reinvestment in mobilizing critical theorizing and practice is constantly informing one another needs to be at the forefront. So, with presented with the question of has student development remained relevant, we say, we always have to actually answer the question. We say yes, but with a critical imagining of student development, as being prime. And we hope that this article provides some guidance and what this can look like moving forward for the field. But with that, I think I am right at time. So thank you all so much for your engagement. I look forward to questions and answers. And of course, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach on out.
Wonderful. Thank you, Antonio. Next up, we have Michael Brown and Rachel Smith to talk about campus ecology.
Thanks, Gudrun. So good afternoon. My name is Michael Brown, and I'm presenting today with my colleague Rachel Smith. We're coming to you from Iowa State, although Rachel is not in Ames with me today. But Iowa State is located in the ancestral homelands of the Bocage or Iowa Nation. And so our project today is about taking existing campus ecological frameworks and advancing them through the use of both the theory of social networks and also the analytical potential that social network analysis offers. So I'm
Thanks.
going to hand it over. Sorry.
So we start from the now well-known Wren and Arnold adaptation of Bronfenbrenner's model, including ecological perspectives, which says that development occurs in contexts across levels that inform one another. And they also involve people, processes, and time. So the PPCT model. Recently, scholars have iterated on this for about 20 years. And recently, we've had models that include validation from Kitchen et al., as well as more intentional thinking around how oppression manifests in this model, not just in the macro system, but throughout through pieces like Chelsea Noble's dissertation. So it's not just that context exists, but it's specifically how students connect across and between the contexts and how they navigate those that affect the social structures for equity and learning. So essentially, we're taking context and we're applying specific observations of structure to that context so that we can better understand how things like power and exclusion and inclusion operate on our campus environments. So Michael and I proposed the campus ecological network model, which starts with a student's network. So for illustration purposes, we'll focus on the red dot in the middle. So that's our focal student. The lines are relationships between people, which the student may know or not know about. The lines contain content, so that might be things like friendship or social support. It might be negative interactions or oppressions. And also the absence of lines can be meaningful, so whether relationships exist or not. So these structures have value and content, and this is really what helps us specify how power operates here. And so laying the ecological model onto that helps us think about the microsystems the students are embedded in. So students can say, these folks know each other, and this is the context we interact in. These are the content of the relationships. And those overlapping microsystems then make up the mesosystem, which is where most of our focus tends to be when we're looking at campus environments. Then we add how these networks change over time, because we know that student networks are not static in the least. And so the model helps us think about the relational processes that are occurring, things like learning and identity development. It draws on sociological theory around structural inequality and what facilitates or interrupts those processes. It also draws on network mechanisms for why and how ties form, why they're likely to develop, or why they're perhaps likely to go away or fall apart. And so this is in some our theory, and we want to think more and illustrate with an example from practice.
So in our article, and we go into this at length, obviously in the manuscript, but we take the case of two students in their first year on campus and attempt to sort of map the campus ecological networks onto the experiences that they were having. The focus of this study was how students form relationships around a focal introductory STEM course that was a gateway to a number of STEM-focused majors on campus. So the first student that we're going to look at here is Kai. They identify as non-binary, and a lot of the challenges that Kai experienced in their efforts to form a community in this classroom were around the gendered nature, not just of STEM environments, but also the student support services that we develop to try to address inequality that emerges in these STEM environments because of their heteronormative and heterosexist sort of social norms. So in their first year on campus, Kai had only a couple of friends that they could really connect with, right? They had a roommate. They were part of this larger physics course, but most of the people that they were drawing on for social support, to develop a sense of belonging, to vent, and to look for resources were actually friends who were external to the institution that they connected with online, and then family who were also outside of the campus environment. And so in that first semester, Kai reported a lot of feelings of social isolation, a lack of desire to persist in the major despite their aspirations for their career being relatively the same. They attempted to connect through the Women in STEM program because that was where they were directed based on their perceived gender identity and the residence hall that they were living in. But the Women in STEM program didn't work for them because part of the culture of that group was about being women in STEM, and that context, those set of relationships, even though Kai possessed them, didn't really provide the sort of informational or social support benefits that they were looking for. And so this changes a little bit in the spring because Kai connects with a different sort of broader and more diverse group of folks. One of the things that they do is find a set of social connections through the LGBTQI Center on campus and develop a friend group that way. Those folks are willing and able to share resources. The challenge that Kai identifies with those relationships is that those folks are not connected to their major and their coursework, right? So there's this bifurcated social world that emerges where they can get lots of social support and not as much academic support. And their off-campus connections persist in terms of their strength. A number of one of the courses that they had to take in the spring was a team-based learning class. And so they were required to work with 4 folks who had actually been in the focal course in the fall. But they acknowledged that those relationships were kind of contextually bound and temporally bound, and they didn't necessarily expect those relationships to carry over into future semesters and provide the kind of academic support and honestly encouragement that they were looking for. And so what does this mean for practice, right? How do we use these networks to think about both theory that is generative for practice and praxis implications, right? One of the things that we can see when we enact networks is how power circulates and where it is maybe in some cases hoarded, and in other cases where sparse networks create environments where students cannot access resources or social support on campus. So if you're familiar with Janet McCabe's work, one of the things that she illustrates in her book, Connecting in College, is that women of color in particular are much more likely to be excluded from social relationships. They intentionally build smaller and more dense networks, largely of other women of color who share their social identities, as a way to buffer institutional violence. But a challenge that results then is that they don't have the kind of weak ties that allow them to capitalize on the opportunities that flow from weak ties or the informational resources that flow from weak ties. So we can see how these intentionally constructed networks that are meant to benefit students also in many ways constrain their opportunities on campus. A lot of what Kai was doing in their own particular experience was about boundary management and identity construction. They would share different gender pronouns. They would share different aspects of their identity based on what context that they were in. And so identity construction and negotiation became a very kind of social and temporally bounded process. There's also larger community dynamics that happen here, right? Because of Kai's perceived gender, they were often excluded from things that they wanted to do in the classroom because students tended to form groups around homophily of perceived gender identity and racial identity. What we really see happening here, and students enact this a little bit, and then we do it in the design of our campus environment, are these siloed campus ecologies where the LGBT student resources exist around the center for Kai, and they have to do bridging work to bring those relationships and resources into the classroom in many cases. And so there's a lot of acknowledgement in these networks of invisibilized boundary spanning labor. And this labor largely tends to be saddled on the shoulders of minoritized students already who are doing that work to create environments that then buffer other forms of institutional violence. And one of the things that we observed in the larger manuscript is that network approaches can actually highlight for us how the same intervention can produce vastly disparate results for students based on both their social context and then the structure of their network. Kai was doing everything we tell a student to do in that first year. They were connecting with people on campus, they were going to stuff, they were showing up, they were participating and they were engaged, they went to Women in STEM, but they weren't getting the same benefit out of it, either academically or socially as other students, because of the structure of their network, right? They weren't building strong ties through women in STEM. In fact, they weren't building any ties, even though they were engaged from a behavioral and even cognitive perspective. So we think networks can, in fact, add a lot to these engagement models or challenge our assumptions about engagement models. So thank you. If you have any questions, we would love to chat further. We also have is the website up, Rachel? We have a website for our networks lab that is up. Okay. If it's not, it will be up soon. But all of this stuff is also in the digital repository. We have a number of studies where we're trying to apply this conceptual framework. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael and Rachel. All right, next up we have, I get to introduce a large author team that are all able to be here, Adam, Anna, and Heather.
Great, thank you. Adam, am I doing the PowerPoint?
Nope, I got
Or
it.
can you do it? You got it, go ahead, shoot.
Of course, I can't find the... oh, here we go. Okay.
Great. Well, thanks for the invitation, and we were delighted to contribute to this issue. This is a long-standing research team, and we are here to present a chapter that really is about looking back and anticipating what we have to look at. And we just heard one of the ways in which, from Michael and Rachel's work, that certainly student affairs has to think about social media as part of a functionality of student development. Adam, you want to switch for me? Very, very quickly, we want to make clear that we're defining social media in a particular way. These are multiple forms of a medium, a technological medium, and all of the applications, platforms, etc. In our particular chapter, the focus was on thinking about the very exponential and quick rise since 2009, back when we were only thinking about social networking, all right, to the present, where we see an evolution from a defining moment where technology really impacted student life on campus, student life off campus, adolescent to late adolescent student development. And in that evolution, moving through the technology in relation to their effects on college student development. So from web-based social networking all the way through to the ubiquity that we have today, where it is very much a seamless environment, a seamless online to in-person environment. And in that seamlessness and in that evolution, what we see is, want to switch for me? Awesome. The fact that we do have generational differences, for as much as we don't like to overgeneralize across generations, we do see and try to focus on particular generations having particular forms of dispositions around social media. Gen Z is a generational moment that captures certainly the evolution of where we are today and how we want to think about social media affecting college student development in the future. And particularly, we focused on areas where we see direct relationship between identity development, the realization of identity, especially around ethnicity, and the ways in which social media do and don't impact that development right before college and right through college. We also focused a bit on how it is that we're seeing that correlation go into areas that we have historically in higher education research and in student affairs research talked about as the relationship between belonging or a sense of belonging and identity development, and really link that to how we're understanding mental health data and then the effects of social media, or less the effects and more the impact of social media, given its ubiquity, given its clear sense of attenuating to all of the distinctions of how students see themselves, don't see themselves, how others see them, how others don't see them, and how they internalize all of that. And thinking back to Michael's presentation, how we're thinking about those bonds, strong and weak bonds, and how that does affect how a student constructs self.
So I can go ahead and take over and talk about the implications as it relates to practice in our field. So the first element here is as social media platforms and usage is ever evolving, but again, ubiquitous as part of the student experience. It's important for practitioners and even scholars alike to keep pace with social media. I mean, an important example here is that for many of us who are occasionally or moderately active on Facebook, that's no longer the platform of choice for our students. And if you talk to them, many of them are on Snapchat, TikTok, or in some of the other work that I'm doing, students are often using Snapchat instead of text messaging, right? They're doing all their messaging and communication within these applications. So it's just important for practitioners to be aware of the platforms and how students are engaging with them in order to maintain relevance and understanding the student experience. It's also important to recognize that social media can be used as a mechanism to promote student learning and success. And so rather than a space of avoidance, I think there are many great examples out there of how student affairs functional areas or units have used social media, or practitioners use social media to actively engage and support and student learning, development, and success. So again, instead of shying away from social media, we advocate for finding ways to utilize social media in practice. The other thing, just for folks to continue to be aware of, is that social media will continue to affect the college student experience, not only online or in digital spaces, but also impact the in-person experience and have effects on students. So being prepared for students who are affected by various incidents online, whether it be racialized aggressions or other traumatic experiences, or just the rapid response and organization of students in online spaces. So it's going to be an important and continue to be an important realm within our practice. And then finally, and I think ultimately, in my view, most importantly, identifying opportunities to promote and foster digital agency or digital citizenship. As we can think about with the relevance of things like fake news or other topics, helping students discern and understand how to engage on social media, understanding the relevance and permanence of information that's put online is vitally important. And I think a realm where folks in our field can have an indelible impact on the learning and growth of students.
And as we think about going forward into the future for our practice, to be able to think about addressing social media and professional development, a lot of times we make the assumption that people have been using social media forever, but to think about that transition, particularly in transition points when our students go from undergraduate students to graduate assistants to professional staff members, to be able to think about the ways that we coach individuals and that we work together and learn about how things are shifting. Also to think about valuing students' voices and decisions related to social media. I think a lot of times we think about the negatives, but also to think about the positives. One example is an institution that we work with that has a number of social media fellows that are undergraduate students. So they work with the university to help with their different social media platforms, doing takeovers to be able to think about what content would work with students, what wouldn't. So they're gaining real world experience that they can utilize in the job market after they graduate, as well with helping the university and thinking through, so what are the ways that we can be helpful? And then thinking about student-generated content. For areas of research, it's thinking about where are the gaps in the scholarship, such as digital agency and some other areas. Also, the call recently by the Surgeon General to think about longitudinal research that needs to take place,
I know some of that work that Adam is doing now for middle school and high schoolers and how that goes into college and adulthood. So thinking about the longitudinal research over time, and also thinking about the ways that AI are also a part of social media and the work that's done in AI on its own, both in and outside of the classroom, and the ways that that's impacting the experiences of students. So thank you all very much. And we'll look forward to questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And now I get to turn it over to Dawn Johnson. You're muted, Dawn.
Thank you. My Zoom skills are a little rusty.
It's summer. We're all a little rusty.
Yes, indeed. So my name is Dawn Johnson, and I am happy to present our invited article on behalf of my co-authors, Caleb Briscoe from the University of Oklahoma and Lucy Lepeau from Indiana University. And let me get myself going here. Oh. First, I want to acknowledge that I am coming to you from Syracuse University, which occupies the homelands of the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the sovereign Haudenosaunee. As a resident of Syracuse, New York, I pay respect to the Haudenosaunee people and recognize the ongoing history of dispossession and express gratitude for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas on their homelands. And given that we are talking about racial climate in this article, it was important also to acknowledge the labor in terms of the economic growth and development of the United States, which has been made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans and their ascendants who suffered the horror of the transatlantic trafficking, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow. And we are indebted to their labor and sacrifice and must acknowledge the tremors of that violence through the generations and the resulting impact that can still be felt and witnessed today. So we all know, we're well aware of the current realities that are challenging our campuses these days. The fading racial reckoning of 2020, which seems like a very distant memory. The anti-DEI, anti-LGBT legislation across many states that has a chilling effect across the country. Job losses, program cuts, curricular bans, limited access to healthcare, and it goes on. Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia as a result of political decisions and foreign policy decisions which challenge our ideas and boundaries of academic freedom, free speech, safety, and civility. Students protesting and resistance and thinking about what are students' rights, what are their responsibilities for assembling, and how does that contribute to our climate on campus? And then, of course, the upcoming presidential election and all that entails, including the difficulty in obtaining reliable facts and information. These are all the things that will contribute to, that are on our minds and will contribute to the climate on our campus as we approach the coming academic year. So when we were thinking about our article, what we wanted to talk about, we really felt it important to lean into the work of Sylvia Hurtado and her colleagues. And if you've been following her research over the last 20 plus years, this idea of campus climate has really evolved into a more complex and dynamic entity. It's not just a singular thing, even though maybe our campus is portrayed in that way, but thinking about the complexity of the campus climate, thinking about the important critical contexts and that are sort of broadly described in the model, and things that relate to, again, the current realities that we're in, the social, historical, the policy landscape, what's happening institutional wise, what's happening in our local communities and beyond. And then thinking specifically about the climate for diversity. And again, in a more complicated, holistic manner, thinking about the history, the institutional history. What does the organizational structure look like? What are the compositional, the numerical dimensions, which is often the place where our institutions like to focus in terms of where they can address things and how they measure success. thinking about the psychological and behavioral aspects. So the interactions that folks have on campus and how those interactions make people feel and think about their place, the co-curricular and curricular offerings and opportunities. And so what is available to help mitigate the impact of the campus climate, to build our awareness about who we're sharing space with and the different experiences and perspectives that folks bring to the campus community. And of course, then tying campus racial climate to important outcomes. Not just sort of feel good moments, but really important outcomes related to retention, academic achievement, thinking about the competencies that we need to help students develop for living in a pluralistic and multicultural and global world, thinking about lifelong learning as also as an important outcome, and thinking about then what are the social equity, civic engagement, and economic opportunities that result from students participating in higher education, and how their experiences of the racial climate contribute to that and their further knowledge. So in the article, we outline we try to take a little case study approach and outline different institutions and some of their responses. And so rather going through each one of those, I thought it would be important to kind of get to thinking about what are some strategies for resisting and responding as we think about as a campus climates evolve, and as students and faculty and staff, all of us are experiencing what's happening. So another campus climate is not always the answer, because as many of you know, we often know actually what people are experiencing. And sometimes our leadership may see assessment of the campus climate as an end of itself. And so we take the assessment, we check the box, and we move on. And sometimes that's not always the answer. Sometimes we have existing forms of data that we can gather and collate to help us give insight to what's happening on the climate without sending out another survey or having another student forum or doing more other kinds of data collection. We often have things that are available right away to us. Many of us might agree that performative statements are not enough, that they have to be accompanied by authentic efforts at healing and moving forward. So oftentimes there are things that happen on a campus, and there's that initial crisis response from leadership. And then once that sort of has died down, there isn't a healing process, right? And for people who have worked on campuses through multiple, say, student protests, that's a very traumatic experience for folks. And there isn't a sense of healing in the aftermath sometimes. And so that's important to not just sort of have these statements up front about what institutions are committed to doing, and perhaps a statement on the backside, like now that we've gone through it, but really attending to healing and moving forward. That responding to campus climate incidents must happen with active listening, honest communication, and collaborative action. One of the things that we noted in the report in our article was after the campus climate issues and protests at University of Missouri, which seems like a long time ago now, they actually commissioned a self-study by the American Council of Education to review what happened and how they can move forward. And I think some of what comes out of that is this idea of active listening, being honest in communication, and being collaborative in their action. Also thinking about foregrounding student mental health concerns regarding the campus climate and institutional responses. This is really critical in thinking about, again, the sort of aftermath and the trauma and the challenging experiences that students come away with particularly when there's been a really big public incident, but also those sort of daily microaggressions, those daily occurrences that really take a toll on students' mental health, and thinking about the way in which social media can be both supportive for that and outlets for students in this way, but also get in the way and sometimes contribute to the campus climate. Thinking about also, how do we use data to demonstrate the impact of the various DEI initiatives in documenting the impact of the losses? And it's important because a lot of times folks who were just sort of looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion as an add-on, but not an integral part of the work that we do, and an integral part of the learning that takes place, that happens as a result of the, or can happen as a result of the college experience. The presence of those programs and that work means something to our students' educational experiences. And so it's important to also think about, now that we're in this moment of anti-legislation and the chilling effect, even in states that aren't experiencing these legislative bans, what is the impact of this work? And then what is the impact of the loss of this work on students, on staff, on faculty? Thinking about creative ways to use discretionary funds, internal budgets to kind of support programs that have been defunded, and sort of getting creative around, well, how do we, if there are ways to still do this work, but we call it something else. So do we think about calling the word campus engagement or other kinds of language that may not put our campuses on the radar as a flag for concerned legislators, right, but still allow for the work to get done? So thinking about being creative in those ways, specifically thinking about in the SCOTUS decision, Supreme Court decision, thinking about holistic admissions reviews and recruitment activities. I was recently in a conversation with some undergraduate admission folks and about what their practice was. And it made me think about, what does that mean for us as graduate faculty and our work, and how do we do a holistic admission review for student affairs, preparation, graduate programs, and recruitment activities where we may not be able to foreground some of our priorities and values in the ways that we used to. And then thinking about, how do we lean into institutional policies for shared governance and academic freedom, and how we can use those as guides, but also ways to respond to the challenges to the anti-DEI challenges that we're facing. And it was important for us, lastly, to kind of end our piece on the sense of critical hope, right? So at the beginning of my sharing here, just outlining all of the challenges feels very daunting, and it was helpful to ground ourselves in critical hope scholars like Fieri and West and Hooks and Duncan Andrade, to think about that it's not just enough for us to name and critique the systemic injustice. We don't want to become cynical. We don't want to become hopeless, because then we are stuck and can't move forward. And so critical hope becomes then is an action and a practice that allows us to face these deep-seated injustices, to engage and be committed to resistance strategies, to develop visions of equity with consistent, intentional, and collective work, to think about, how do we use our spheres of influence, and to be able to center the humanizing values and equity principles of our field. Critical hope just acknowledges that, yes, we have a lot of work to do, and it can feel insurmountable, but we've got to be committed to action of moving forward, action of working collectively and collaboratively, little by little, to continue the march toward equity. And so I just like to close with just obviously some of our references if folks want to learn more about these ideas of critical hope in particular as a way of sustaining yourself as we move forward into another academic year that will present its share of challenges, as well as to read more about Hurtado's work. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. All right. And so next up, I have the opportunity to share one of my pieces, and joining me today is one of our co-authors, Rachel Pridgeon. Unfortunately, Isaiah Thomas, our third co-author, was unable to join us today. But so our article focuses on disrupting student affairs departure, examining needed changes to the field of student affairs to attract and retain a diverse workforce. And so I will turn it over to Rachel to tell you a little bit about our study.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gudrun. So we actually want to spend a lot more of our time on like the departure model and some of those practical education. So I'm going to go over kind of the methodology of this work and like the framework that really sets up that departure model a little bit more fully. So our study used the constructivist grounded theory, so we can really strive to understand what leads student affairs professionals to leave our field. Our study was also grounded using a transformative paradigm, which is essentially an approach that's rooted in a critique of power relationships with emancipatory goals for individuals and transformative goals for institutions and systems of oppression. So we collected data through 2 semi-structured virtual interviews and using simple, direct, and spontaneous coding. And our research team, as Gudrun was just talking about, is consisting of 2 faculty and at the time 2 practitioners, of which 2 are white women, an African-American male, and 2 of us identify as parents. So you'll see on our next slide kind of an outline of our participants and their demographics, so you can take a look at that yourself. But I really want to actually highlight the framing of our study. The first was in white supremacy culture, which is the idea that there are beliefs, values, and standards that teach us through both overt and covert ways that basically whiteness, and in particular that white upper middle class culture, white and upper middle class and middle class, is the norm. And that's what ultimately should be highlighted and valued. The second was this ideal worker norm, which is the idea that workers are more highly valued when they devote themselves to the job. So they're committing all of their hours in the day as needed. There's no outside distraction, so there's no responsibilities at home. And you know, I remember when I was in my own personal experience, when I was first starting out 15 years ago, that, you know, I was working and it was almost a badge of honor to say I worked 12 hours yesterday and I'm working, you know, for the next 20 days straight. So ideal worker norms and really breaking that down a little bit more. So with that, I'll actually pass it right back to Gudrun, who will really start diving into the fun stuff, which is the departure model more directly.
Yes, and so on the right side, you can see our full model. And since there's a lot happening, on the left side, we've pulled out little sections so that you can see those in more detail. And so starting kind of from the left side, right, of how folks enter our profession, a lot of times, and some of that will probably resonate or hopefully resonate with many of you, right? We joined this field because it aligns with our values and social identities. And so we're socialized into the field also, right, to focus on those values and identities. And that really shapes our initial approach to work, right? This values-driven approach to work and the internalization of ideal worker norms, right, as Rachel just shared, where we think this is how we do the work. Well, then what happens, right, is this approach to work, right, pushes against some of the institutional policies, practices, and leadership that are really rooted in white supremacy culture and conflict, right, with the values that we say we uphold as a field. And so in particularly, some of the things that came out of our study was this misalignment of espoused and enacted value. The fact that staff don't feel value, right? We talk a lot about we're a family in student affairs, but it doesn't always feel that way, right? Or only certain people are truly part of that family. these ideal worker norms, right? Of really wanting to have workers that fit this mold of being available, being around, being able to do all these things and prioritize work. And then also these exclusive leadership practices, right? That really conflict with some of the values we uphold of collaboration and having different voices being heard. And that's not what our participants experienced in the leadership that they had at their institutions. And so that created conflict for them, right? And that conflict for many of them started small and then started building over time. And one of the things that's unique about our study is that a lot of our participants actually had been in the field for a significant amount of time. So a lot of previous studies on retention or departure of student affairs staff had really focused on early career, right? And we know we tend to lose a lot of folks in early career, but there hadn't been as much looking at people who'd been in the field for 6, 10, 15 years. And over the past few years, right, we've seen a huge exodus of folks who've been in the field for a really long time. And so we really started with our participants that it was this conflict was just, it kept building and building and getting bigger, right? The other piece, and that might seem familiar from some of the literature you've probably read before, is that supervisor, and to a lesser extent, but still important, also colleagues, right, played a really important role in this. They either exacerbated the conflict that people were feeling, or they created a buffer. And there was one quote from one of our participants that stands out to me with that, right? And he said that if I still had my last supervisor, I probably would have stayed in the field for longer, but I probably still would have left, right? But then when he switched to a different supervisor, that pushed him out of the field much faster. And so supervisors have this ability to shape our experiences in student affairs, but they're not able to actually change, right, some of these things. And so it's this buffer that might keep you in the field longer, or it might be this toxic supervisory relationship or this toxic environment that pushes you out. But in the end, there's still these larger forces, right, that are happening, and people probably still would have left. The other thing that we found was that the environmental context, right, played a big part as well, but weren't the reason why folks left, right? And we often hear about the Great Resignation during COVID and how the pandemic led to that. And there's definitely truth to that, right? But it wasn't. A lot of what we heard from participants was that it wasn't the pandemic. It was more that the pandemic gave them time to think about it, or made some of the challenges that they knew were there bigger or more visible. And so it made them think about it more, right? There was also a racial reckoning happening that made people rethink how they think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and really recognize that their values and the values they were told this field upholds didn't align with what their institution was doing or how institutional decisions were made. There was also the Great Resignation, right? There was one participant who said, well, you know, I never really thought about leaving, but then everyone else left. And so that got me thinking, right? And so it helped him realize there was something out there that he could do outside of student affairs, which wasn't something he'd really thought about before. The other piece that's important to notice is that there was also changes in personal life and priorities for many of our participants. And some of that happened just as, right, life happens with growing older, but some of it was also impacted by these environmental contexts, right? The stress of parenting during the pandemic, the stress of just navigating, right, a pandemic, or maybe feeling really isolated. And so thinking about how, right, if student affairs has been your life and all your friends are your colleagues, right, what did that mean during the pandemic when you were suddenly isolated and away from work? And so these changes, right, in personal life and priorities also led to that conflict, right, and created conflict with the way folks were approaching their work in student affairs. And so all of that led to thoughts about departure. And important to notice, right, that there was really a range for our participants on what their thoughts were around departure. There were some people who said, you know, I loved student affairs, so I still love this field, but it's just not a good fit right now anymore. And maybe I'll come back in a few years, maybe not, right? We'll kind of see what happens. But it just wasn't like the time for them to stay in the field anymore. And then there were some people who really felt disillusioned by the field, right? Or who pointed out the negative impact that working in the field had on their physical and mental health and their life. And so it was really a wide range of where people fell in terms of these thoughts about departure. And also interesting, right? For a lot of our participants, they hadn't really looked at better opportunities until they started thinking about departure. But then when they started exploring options, that's when they found out that there are better opportunities, right? There are opportunities to have better work-life balance that we often hear, right, in higher ed, stay in higher ed because the benefits are so great. Some of our participants said, right, as they started looking into it, of course it varied, but there were some companies that had better benefits than what they'd found in higher education. And so once they started to see these better opportunities, that's what then pushed them over the edge, right, to say, okay, I'm going to make that jump and I'm going to depart the field. And so obviously our hope in creating this model, right, was to find ways to disrupt departure and help retain folks in the field and even just better, right, the experiences for people in the field. And the biggest piece with this that we need to do a both and approach, right? We need to focus on preparing staff for current contexts as well as disrupting white supremacy culture. And so I'll turn it back over to Rachel to talk about how do we prepare staff for the current contexts that we're facing.
Thank you, Gudrun. So, I mean, it's so big, right? And things that we really want to be able to do now. And there's also this much larger context that we need to fix. So first, the now. So one of the first things we really established was building those healthy approaches to work. And that starts in that grad school environment. So integrating and adapting that as soon as they get into the field through grad school is so important. And it's not just to talk about it, right? But also to integrate that support through policies, actual practices, and social norms. So if an early career or even mid-career sees their boss leave at 5 or leave at an appropriate time or adjust their time, then they might actually be a little bit more healthy in their own work-life balance. A lot of different options within there. Around the misalignment of values, really thinking about how we can prepare our grad students for that change management. So to start thinking about a focus of coalition building and collective self-care, when so many of our, now to be Gen Z students are looking to their peers to say, what are they doing to ultimately inform what they are going to be doing? It allows for that coalition to really build those habits right away. And so they can start modeling some really those great opportunities for growth. Next, our supervisors, as our study really showed, was so much of the emphasis was on the supervisor being that fulcrum at times of, yes, I would stay in the field, or no, I wouldn't, and it's because of my supervisor, or I started looking because of my supervisor, my relationship. So how can we strengthen that preparation? How do we get those supervisors, those managers, those department heads to understand how they can really enforce and have some great conversations and growth conversations with their direct reports, as opposed to kind of putting some punitive kind of damages that could enhance, their misalignment, their values really going in the negative direction. And then finally is emphasizing overly indexing that peer support. So understanding just the importance of things like ACPA and those networking across institutions, that institutional support for that engagement. I know that budgets are tight, but finding opportunities, maybe some more local opportunities or virtual opportunities for engagement and those professional developments and networks. So those are just some of the kind of the scratching of the surface of things that we can do with the current context. But I'll send it on back to Gudrun to kind of think the wider context of white supremacy culture.
Yes. And so, right, a big part is also trying to disrupt this white supremacy culture. And so part of it is rejecting this do less with more culture, right? One of the things, and my faculty colleagues laugh at me because I constantly say, how do we do less and just do less, right? And that's it. And so it should say reject to do more with less culture. What we should do is to do less with more, right? We also want to think about job descriptions, right? And really assess the complexity and the workload of positions. Is it realistic what we're asking folks to do? Are the things that have been added over time? How do we center DEI values in decision-making processes, right? And that's hard because at the end, right, institutions need to make money and they need to be sustainable and they live within complex contexts, right? And capitalism and all of those things. But how do we think more about how we center our values in these decisions? And then really looking at organizational structures, right, that allow us for connecting among practitioners across functional areas and hierarchical levels to decrease some of those silos and foster collective problem solving. And so with that, thank you everyone for listening to our article, and I get to turn it over to Michelle Espino, who will talk about leadership.
Okay, hopefully folks can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. I'm Michelle Espino Lira, use she, her, ella pronouns. And today I am discussing university leadership as a racialized space. So I won't spend too much time delving into the literature, but there has been work, extensive work on leadership within university systems. Particularly thinking about having diverse leadership teams and what that means in terms of crafting policy and practice for our students. Thinking about bottom-up leadership and how at the grassroots level we can implement change. Also thinking about having collectivist orientations, equity-mindedness, and investigating our own positionality as leaders. A lot of these are actually geared towards folks in dominant positions who are needing to be convinced that equity work is important and isn't something that is just inherently part of their work. And so I think we really have to challenge some of that when we're thinking about, leadership development, particularly for university leaders and senior leaders. Because really, with racially ethnically minoritized student affairs professionals, the representation of Latina in particular senior student affairs officers is abysmal. When we have 18%, if not more, Latino, Latinx students on college campuses today. Only 3.4% are university presidents and only 4.3% are senior student affairs officers. And this data hasn't been updated in a while, and I'm curious about what it looks like now. But basically, it takes a doctorate, 25 years of professional experience, 9 different positions, and at least 1 institutional change to become a senior student affairs officer. And you certainly need to be able to hone the skills that are listed here, but I haven't found literature that really focuses on, along with all of these different skills, you need to be thinking about equity-mindedness. You need to be thinking about social justice. And there's very limited discussions about the racial realities for racially and ethnically minoritized professionals who are aspiring into these leadership positions. A recent survey by NASPA of its membership asked the question about social justice and the role of DEI. And of course, this was in 2022. And so be interesting to see what folks are facing now. But we know there's been some just horrible dismantling of DEI initiatives across the country. But 84% of the membership that returned the survey believe that social justice, equity, and inclusion would be, somehow change their current role. How that was going to happen, they weren't sure, but it was going to change. And 91% believed that they would support, right? They're prepared to support DEI. And as we see further, as you delve in further, you realize that what does support really mean? What does it really look like? Only 31% felt adequately prepared to actually manage social justice equity within their own work. And 53% felt prepared to lead in these kinds of initiatives. So there seems to be this kind of odd disconnect between saying that they support DEI, but not having the skills and the development to be able to lead and manage DEI efforts across campus and within their offices. So I thought that was pretty intriguing. So we know from the literature, mid-levels manage a whole lot. They are often the glue between senior leadership and our entry-level administrators, and they're often having to translate the goals and the values from the senior leadership into the actual practices that are happening directly affecting students. They often have heavy workloads, and as our colleagues have already mentioned, there's very limited recognition for their efforts. And there's also this kind of adage that everyone talks about, in order to move up, you have to move out. And that really does affect many racially, ethnically minoritized administrators who really want to stay with communities, stay with family, and don't want to have to leave to spaces where they may not be comfortable or be in hostile environments. But we are seeing that racially ethnically minoritized professionals, no matter where they are, do face isolation. They do face hostile work environments. There's bias present in evaluation processes, and they're often excluded from resources and from influential networks that would help them to develop the leadership skills necessary to become a senior student affairs officer. So for my study, I have interviewed since 2015, 93 mid-level Latina student affairs administrators who aspire to senior leadership. A majority of them are cisgender women. Most of them, the highest level of education is a master's degree in student affairs or something related to it. And most of them are actually in either student engagement, residence life, or DEI. And I just finished interviewing folks in 2022, and so I'm interested to see how many remain in the profession and are still in kind of DEI offices or doing things related to DEI work. So it would be interesting to see where they are now. Most of the sample was comprised of Mexican American Chicanx communities, followed by Puerto Rican and Dominican. And they had about 9 years of experience on average, and well over half were at that assistant, associate, or director level positions within their divisions. So I took a grounded theory approach, and I explore this much more further in the article. But I used 3 different concepts to help me really think about student affairs in particular and accessing those leadership roles. And so really thinking about student affairs and higher education in general as a racialized organization. And then within that, knowing that leadership was a particular space. And so whenever we're thinking about space, there are social geographers that often talk about race and power as also being part of a space. And then that also made me think as a critical race theorist about how that space could become property, right? And so so Harris talks about whiteness as property, and I particularly looked at leadership as a status property. And so those 3 different concepts helped me really think through this emerging theory that I'm developing. So as I apply these sensitizing concepts, what I'm uncovering is that certainly student affairs divisions are racialized spaces. And some of this is because so many of the participants were in one-person offices with very limited resources, limited staffing, and were being asked to carry the load for DEI initiatives, even if that even wasn't part of their responsibilities. They also, for all that we do to advocate for students and to feel like we are the voice for students on our college campuses, I really believe, and what I'm trying to assert here, and it might be something for us to think about, is the way in which the profession has created a facade of progressiveness. Because we see this happening for students, right? We're very eager to support students, but our own work environments are creating microaggressions. Folks are experiencing being tokenized. People are having to hide their families and communities for fear of being stereotyped. And so these are really challenging experiences that folks are having within their work environments. And there's certain gatekeeping functions that keep them from being able to advance. So this notion that we don't promote from within, right? That we really want the quote unquote best candidate. And for some reason, an internal candidate who might be racially, ethnically minoritized is not the ideal candidate for an advancement. And then in the other element, I wanted to think about student affairs divisions. Not only are they racialized spaces, but they also have expressions of power. And so there are spaces of exclusion and isolation for so many racially, ethnically minoritized, and particularly Latinx student affairs administrators, who also have a great deal of uncertainty about how am I going to move up if I have to move out, right? Or if I have to leave, this area of the country, or I have to leave my community. There's restricted access to social networks of communities that look like them, that have shared experiences, because we don't have enough racially ethnically minoritized representation at the senior levels. Because we often think one is enough. And so what happens when you are the only one? And so as a result, scarcity begins to build, right? So you begin to work under the scarcity mindset. And so any racially, ethnically minoritized people might, who are working in a division, might feel like they're having to fight for the crumbs on the table versus building the solidarity to create their own table. And so this leads to this idea that senior student affairs leadership is a form of property, and that so much of the work of racially, ethnically minoritized professionals is to, engage in this emotional labor where they're having to play the game. They have a pressure to perform whiteness, otherwise they won't be promoted. And often they're placed in these positions where they have to leverage their own humble backgrounds as a strategy for inclusion. And so at some point, folks are having to unearth racial trauma in order to be valued within their divisions. And so there is an issue happening here where as the only one, you're trying to not fight into the stereotypes, but then you're also trying to say, I had these lived experiences. I know what it is like. That's why I'm fighting for students. I'm advocating for students. So inevitably, this becomes detrimental for those who are aspiring to move into leadership roles. So as I thought about, what could university leadership as a racialized space look like, what I want to leave us with is to name that leadership is not neutral. It is inherently race, gendered, class. It's also, we need to contend with cis heterosexism, along with other forms of oppression. We need to think about the fact that pathways for racially, ethnically minoritized leaders are really constrained. Using scarcity as certainly a gatekeeping tactic, but there's also this structural exclusion. So limiting resources, limiting staffing really keeps people from being able to do the kind of work that they need to do. And that this notion of formal credentialing and notions of professionalism, they cloak whiteness. And that, adds to this idea of who is a legitimate leader, right? And so who has that leadership legitimacy as they're trying to move up into these leadership roles. And finally, as I mentioned, this idea of resources, having inequitable distribution of these resources really traps Latina student affairs administrators from being able, between this like entry level and mid-level positions with very limited opportunities for advancement. So I really hope that that's something that we continue to work on as a profession and as a sector of higher education. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I just put in the chat a whole bunch of plugs for upcoming ACPA at 100 events. And we have about 6 minutes left. So I want to open it up for questions. Because as always, when you get scholars passionate about research together, right, we all love to talk. Any questions? And feel free, authors, also to ask questions of each other.
More of a comment to Michelle, your work. I just appreciate your take as somebody who has participated in sort of women in leadership faculty development programs. No one ever talks about race. No one ever talks about gender. No one ever talks about nothing, right? And we're sitting in a room of people identified as women from very different backgrounds. It never comes up in this even when it's directed by women who are not white, right? And so I just to continue to like ring that bell around leadership is not neutral. Like, we know this, but it still gets presented in ways as we try to, as in professional development opportunities, not just even in our work environments, but like, oh, you want to become a leader? Here, go to this workshop, go to this institute, go to this, participate in this program. So I just really appreciate your work in that way.
Thank you so much. That is something that I do talk about in my implications, because I say, you know, I'm very grateful that our professional associations are crafting these leadership institutes for so many of our different communities. And it doesn't mean that, like, for example, the new, you know, vice presidents of Student Affairs Institute that NASPA is hosting shouldn't be talking about race and, you know, and microaggressions and how do you kind of take an equity mindset at those levels. Like, that also needs to be, you know, included. And I think for women, there's very particular elements that we have to discuss. The women in particular, and I'm hoping I can do a separate article about this, is how much they really thought about presentation of themselves, right? And so really being careful about their makeup choices, their hair choices, color, their nails. I mean, it was just like they were so busy worried about that, that it really, like, it's just so much emotional energy that you're spending trying to, like, present yourself in ways that are palatable, that people would consider you as a leader, instead of like the quality of work that you can offer, and the advocacy that you can do. So thank you so much.
Yeah, both of your comments made me think, and this was something that I heard quite a bit about at ACPA, or at least was starting to come up in conversations, right? Is I think as a field, we're really bad at thinking about intersectionality or how we support students and staff in their intersectional identities, right? We always kind of create these like categories and groups, right? And here is, if we talk about race, we just talk about race, but we're not going to talk about gender or sexual orientation or socioeconomic status, right? And if we support women, then we're just going to talk about women, but we're not going to think about all the other intersections, right? And so I do think that's one of the big challenges we're facing as a field, is how do we support students and staff and faculty, right, in their full authentic selves, and really recognize these intersections and what happens within those intersections.
Part of that, I think, is that it isn't just the individual. And that's, I think, what I'm really trying to argue, is that, like, these are structural elements that really hinder us. And so, like, what can we do, you know, to really think about these, like, interlocking systems of resistance? Like, how do we build that? I think that's the element that is just really difficult. But I think that some of our papers, you know, even thinking about the theories paper, right, is so much of our work is built on white dominant frames. And so, you know, maybe there are other ways in which we can socialize graduate students in the profession. It's slow going, but I think it's part of that. It's through the curriculum, it's through our policies, it's through our procedures, right? It's not just about individual experience, but about these structural mechanisms. Yeah.
All right, well, and we're right at time. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the authors for sharing your work. Thank you for all of our participants. It was wonderful to see all of you. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day and a good summer.
Take care, everyone.